Welcome, everyone. I'm Jean, and it's nice to see you all here with us this evening for this presentation called The Boston Massacre Trials, Blood in the Snow. I am muting you as you enter the Zoom call, but please type any questions in the chat box, and I'll pose them to Justice Curran at the end of the hour. However, you do have the ability to unmute yourself as well. And I want to thank the Friends of the Milton Public Library for their support of my events. Our speaker this evening is retired Justice Dennis J. Curran, who served as a Massachusetts trial judge for 15 years. He has presided over 450 civil and criminal trials. He's a graduate of Boston Latin School, received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, and his law degree from the University of Virginia. Justice Curran has received 4 statewide awards for his deep commitments and belief in the justice system and dedication to the law. He has mentored over 100 judicial interns, many of whom keep in touch with him weekly. His lifelong passion has been history. He has been elected a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society and serves on the National Board of Advisors for the Lincoln Forum. He was featured recently on a history panel broadcast on C-SPAN 2 and has lectured extensively before historical societies, civic and educational organizations, and fellow judges. Justice Curran has served as a professor of the practice at Tufts University and teaches at Brown University's summer program. Please join me in a warm welcome for Justice Curran.
Thank you, Jean. Good evening and welcome. Tonight's story features both a hero and a villain. The hero is a young attorney, John Adams, who 30 years later would become the second president of the United States. And the villain, well, the man who, despite the fame accorded to him in the mid-19th century poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, many historians have discovered was one of the first intellectual property thieves in American history. But more about Paul Revere later. John Adams was a young attorney and undertook the notoriously unpopular criminal defense of the captain of the British soldiers charged in the Boston Massacre. Adams courageously took that case in the face of overwhelming and vehement opposition of his fellow Bostonians, his friends, and even his own family. Adams was considered a traitor to the colonial cause by many of his fellow colonists and even by his own cousin, Sam Adams. And in representing what Bostonians considered to be villainous defendants, John Adams epitomized the word professionalism when an attorney is called on by his duty and oath to represent the most unpopular of clients because they deserve representation. And here is how he saw his duty. To what higher calling, to what greater character can any mortal be than to be possessed of all this knowledge, to assist the feeble and friendless, to procure redress, correct wrongs, and to assert and maintain liberty and virtue. Now, at the time, Adams thought that defending these soldiers would probably kill any prospect of his political ambitions, and he was ambitious. So let's turn to our story this evening. It is a snowy winter in 1770, but the cold belies a boiling Boston cauldron, seething with resentment at King George's massive infusion of British troops into the town of Boston. By the way, Boston wasn't considered a city until 1822. Now, this sketch shows the British ships in Boston Harbor. It actually doesn't do justice. The harbor was filled with masks from the British Navy. Over 4,000 British troops were headquartered for duty in the town. And this meant that there were 3 British soldiers for every Boston home. Just weeks before the Boston Massacre, a schoolboy is shot and killed by a Tory, which is a person loyal to the crown. The townspeople are enraged, and radical revolutionary. May I ask everybody to mute their microphones? Thank you. Radical revolutionary Sam Adams organizes the funeral for the poor boy, and all hell is about to break loose in Boston. Bostonians bitterly resent the constant British presence for three reasons. First, the soldiers are paid a meager wage by the crown, and as a result are forced to take odd jobs to make ends meet. And in doing so, what they do is they undercut the wages expected by native Bostonians, many of whom are trying to support their own families. And secondly, the British Navy, which needs manpower, often kidnaps men off the street and impresses them into service on British ships. British law allows them to do just that. And third, Bostonians detest the British soldiers who have the right to be quartered in their homes. And eventually, this leads to the enactment of the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution that declares no soldier shall, in the time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. And the British troops' feelings towards the colonists are mutual. For example, British General Gage has a poor opinion of the colonists, calling them a lawless just letting some folks in, I'm sorry, a lawless and licentious lot. This is what he said. The people were a lawless and licentious lot. The troops are here, contrary to the wishes of the council, assembly, magistrates, and people, and only suffer abuse and ruin. Our story tonight begins on a Friday, please remember that, March 2nd, 1770, when a British soldier is looking for part-time work. He enters into a rope walk building. Now, what is a rope walk? Well, it's a long, straight, narrow lane or covered pathway where long strands of material are laid before being twisted into rope. Now, why do they need rope? Rope is essential for sailing ships. See this British ship? It's a replica of the HMS Victory. Rope is essential in order to run that ship, as you can see. The standard length for a British naval ship is 1,000 feet. And Boston, as a thriving seaport, has dozens and dozens of rope walks darting the harbor. Now, we're back to our rope walk incident. The owner of the rope walk insults the soldier who is simply looking for work and tells him, "We then go clean out my shithouse." I'm just quoting what he said. And a riot breaks out. The soldier is quickly surrounded and jeered by the rope makers. He returns to his guardhouse just 2 blocks away, and incidentally, where the Boston Massacre will take place just 3 days later, and tells his fellow soldiers what has just happened. It is this rope walk incident that sparks the historic confrontation just 3 days later on Monday night. Word of the rope walk confrontation spreads throughout the town, mainly through its taverns, and tension builds throughout the weekend. And here's the timeline of events that led to the Boston Massacre. On March 2nd, the rope walk incident. On Saturday and Sunday, Boston is seething with resentment. On Monday, March 5th, think of it as the new year, when the kids, usually around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, stream into downtown Boston. That's exactly what happened in the Boston Massacre. Everybody came through from the adjoining towns, and all the young men were in there spoiling for a fight with the British. And at about 9 o'clock, the whole place explodes in what comes to be known as the Boston Massacre. Now, it's chilly but pleasant that evening. Chunks of frozen snow and ice are on the sidewalks and streets of Boston, including King Street, now known as State Street. The problems begin in the early evening of that Monday evening when, in front of what was then called the townhouse, and this is the townhouse, there, a wig maker's apprentice starts heckling a British soldier over a supposedly unpaid bill. And here is where that altercation occurred. He yells out to the soldier that he never paid for a wig that his master had made for him. Everybody wore wigs, and all the guys wore wigs in those days. Now, in those days, accusing someone of not paying a bill in public is a relatively serious accusation. The apprentice trails the soldier as he returns to the British guardhouse and taunts him mercilessly. And another soldier, who's also on sentry duty, hears the repeated accusations, as do others, and says, "He's a gentleman, and if he owes you anything, he will pay for it." And the response was, "There is no such thing as a gentleman in this regiment." It was fighting words. The sentry's hackles go up. He advances towards the apprentice. Heated words are exchanged, and the sentry strikes the apprentice with the butt of his musket, knocking him to the ground. Now, by the way, the truth is about that supposed unpaid bill about a wig was that the soldier had actually paid that bill to the master directly, but the apprentice simply didn't know it. But no matter, that's the sort of thing that starts needless fights, something that we see in the courts just about every day. So a small crowd gathers, attracted by the taunting and the altercation. They surround the lone sentry and heckle him. The crowd quickly grows to about 50 people. Some young men throw ice at the sentry. He retreats from his sentry box to the custom house steps and loads his gun. In the meantime, two other crowds are gathering nearby. Tempers are flaring. Crowds are heckling the British soldiers. "Bloody lobster back, lousy rascal, lobster son of a bitch," they shout, calling them lobster backs because of the backs of their bright red uniforms, shown here. Fights are now breaking out across the city. One man exhorts a mob in Dock Square to march upon the soldiers' headquarters, and another crowd streams down an alley. Someone starts ringing the fire bell, bringing dozens more people onto the streets. Now, the British officer of the day is a Captain Preston, and confronted with this quickly spiraling chaos, he paces in front of the British guardhouse, unsure of what to do. He knows that the soldiers have no right to use arms against the civilians unless authorized by a magistrate. But if he does nothing, the mob will kill the sentry. Captain Preston makes his decision and barks out an order to his soldiers to turn out against the mob. "Turn out, main guard," he yells. 7 soldiers run out, some without even have time to put on their coats. Preston moves the men in columns of 2 across King Street with muskets and fixed bayonets. They push through the crowd of now 100 civilians near the customs house, finally reaching that surrounded sentry. Preston orders the sentry to fall into line and starts marching his men back to the main guard, but the crowd surrounds them and blocks them. Hemmed in, the soldiers line up in a semicircle facing the crowd, who are now hurling chunks of ice, snowballs, coal, and oyster shells, of all things, at them. And Captain Preston orders the crowd to disperse, but they're having none of it. Crispus Attucks, A sailor from one of the commercial ships in the harbor is in port. He steps forward, wielding a club, grabs a soldier's bayonet, and knocks him to the ground. The humiliated soldier yells, "Damn you, fire!" And in spurts and with no coordination, the soldiers fire 6 leaden balls into the crowd. Several soldiers load their weapons and prepare to fire again. But Preston orders them to stop firing. And this video reenacts the confrontation.
Judge Curran, does that have audio, the video?
It does. It does
Yeah,
indeed.
it's not, it's only showing images to me. I'm not sure if it's,
Oh, well, they're nice images, but
they're
we'll give you
nice
some audio
images, yeah.
too.
I don't know what
We
everybody
absolutely
else
will
is
help
getting.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, we want to give you the audio too.
okay, great,
Yeah, there
thanks.
we go.
Good,
Now let's see if we got it.
okay.
Can you hear it now? Tell me if you can.
No, I
Okay,
can't,
that's my fault. I'm
but
so sorry.
maybe just volume, huh?
Well, I
Looks
did
like,
put the volume on, but
looks like a
let's
nice
try.
video. Yeah,
Let me know when you hear it.
okay. Um,
Nope, not yet, huh?
no, because it's, no, no. Um,
All right, hold on.
okay. Can anyone else hear it? You can unmute yourself and answer if you like. I do have you all muted, but I'm not sure.
All right.
Jane, no.
No.
Okay,
All
No.
right.
all right.
All right. Well,
Thanks, guys.
bear with me.
Okay.
There we go. You know, I pushed the wrong button. That was my fault. I'm so sorry. Everything was fine until I pushed the button I shouldn't have pushed.
It's okay.
Well, you know what we'll do? We'll just watch the video of it.
Okay.
And I'll do the voiceover. You can hear me now, right? So they
Yeah.
gather over at the Boston Common. And it just, that's not the way it happened that night. But he's instructing these lads. Actually, most of them were young Irish soldiers who had been impressed into service by the crown. And they're going to march off to the townhouse. Let's get them. All right. Okay. And here's the confrontation between the wigmaker's apprentice. He's telling Private White that he's a no good son of a gun, and Private White has had his fill of it. And then the altercation takes place. He throws the colonist to the ground, and the people are, how do I say this politely, angry. Okay, and you can see them gathering around the British soldier, Crispus Attucks. And that's right in front of what they called the townhouse. Now we know it as the State House. And it's just one soldier against probably 40 or 50, and they're quickly gathering from all over the place. And that's where it happens.
Judge Kern, when was this reenactment filmed? How long?
Oh, this was about 12 years ago.
Hmm.
So there's Colonel Preston ordering his people to fall in line. See, what happens is the fire bell's going off and they hear the word fire thinking that there was a fire. And actually,
They actually wanted him to shoot. They wanted them to shoot, right? Not that there was,
right.
yeah.
The only one who gave the order to shoot was the one, actually, he didn't even give the order. It was the fellow who got, the wig maker's apprentice who got thrown to the ground. Excuse me, one of the soldiers who got thrown to the ground by one of the colonists. He was humiliating.
Excuse me, Judge Curran, Nancy's just asking, was the shooting on the corner of State Street in Devonshire?
No, it was not. And I'm going to talk about that at the end. It was it's not at all. It's one of the fallacies. It actually did not occur here where we're seeing it. It happened about 50 yards away at the corner of State or King Street and Congress Street. But we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
There we go. It's a very good question. All right, so we'll go on from there. In any event, Preston gives the order to stop firing, and the Boston Massacre immediately claims 4 dead, including Crispus Attucks, about whom we'll talk a little more later on. And another victim dies within days. Now, word of the shooting reaches acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who rushes to King Street, and he finds an angry mob and a shaken Captain Preston. He speaks with Captain Preston, and then he mounts the balcony of the townhouse to plead for calm and announces, "Let the law have its course. I will live and die by the law." And after midnight, the sheriff obtains a warrant for the arrest of Captain Preston, who undergoes a preliminary hearing during the night and in the morning is charged with murder. Preston is jailed, where he'll remain until his trial 7 months later. So let's move on to the rush for a narrative. The Boston town meeting, which is in those days, there were citizens who governed the town of Boston, acts quickly to shape the narrative and influence the outcome of a trial. And within a week of the event, it's amazing what you can get on the internet. The Boston Gazette, see the date down there? March 12th, 1770. The town meeting appoints a committee to assemble an account and deliver it to, quote, key figures, end quote, in London. Witnesses' statements are taken at Faneuil Hall. When people hear that the judges have decided to delay the trial of the Boston soldiers, a committee of town leaders, led by Samuel Adams out here on the left, that's a caricature of him, and here on the right, Dr. Joseph Warren, accompanied by a mob, disrupt the court proceedings and harangue the justices, and several of the justices refused to conduct business there ever again. It was mob rule in Boston is what was going on. So we move to the defense attorneys. Captain Preston quickly recruits a lawyer, and through intermediaries, he eventually gets John Adams to represent him. And when word gets out of Adams's representation, he is subjected to withering criticism from the townspeople. John Adams's own father is outraged by his son's decision to take the case. And Adams responds that the soldiers deserve counsel and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And here is what Adams later says about his decision to defend Captain Preston. Counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person should want in a free country. The bar ought to be an independent, impartial at all times and in every circumstance. Persons whose lives were at stake ought to have the counsel they prefer. These trials would be as important a cause as ever was tried in any county or country of the world. Captain Preston, though, doesn't help himself. He writes a long, self-serving and inflammatory account disparaging the people of Boston and sends it off to England. London's newspapers pick it up and run with it, and a ship from England returns to Boston with those London newspapers, and the townspeople are enraged to read what Preston says. At Preston's trial, Adams cleverly narrows the legal issue to that of self self-defense and argues the following. Self-defense, self-preservation is the first law of nature. Self-love is the strongest principle in our breasts, and self-preservation not only our inalienable right, but our clearest duty by the law of nature. The judge instructs the jury after the evidence is taken on self-defense, and the instruction that he gives is somewhat modeled on what we see in front of us. This is the modern self-defense instruction drawn from the words that the judge in the Boston Massacre over 250 years ago used. And here's what it says. A person is allowed to the defense, self-defense. If self-defense is present, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant didn't act in self-defense. In other words, if you have a reasonable doubt whether or not the defendant acted in self-defense, your verdict must be not guilty. Now I'm going to try this. Has that the volume there or no?
No volume yet.
Okay. Okay. All right. Paul Giamatti reenacts John Adams's role and pleads self-defense for the soldiers. And after a 6-day trial, the jury finds Preston not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. And in what was later called the soldiers' trial, 2 weeks later, 6 of the soldiers are found not guilty, but 2 are found guilty. Guilty of manslaughter. And now, in a clever legal strategy called the benefit of clergy, invoked by John Adams, he pleads as a sentence for the men found guilty of manslaughter that they suffer simply the branding on their thumb. And I'll show you that in just a second. It's a historic plea. It actually came from the Roman Catholic clergy who might be accused and convicted of a crime. And instead of putting them in prison or killing them, this is what happens in court. I'll show you exactly. The person's hand is held fast, and the branding iron is used to brand the individual, in this case with the letter M for manslaughter, or could be used for murder. And that's the punishment that Adams fixed or asked the judges to impose, and they did agree with him to do that. And these are 2 of the letters that they used in those days, M for murder or manslaughter, or T for thievery or thief.
That is awful. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, it beats being killed.
Yeah.
So how does this history record this dramatic event? The story has echoed through the pages of history, newspapers, history books, pamphlets for over 250 years. But let's talk about the Boston Massacre story. The descriptions of the events of that Monday evening are so contradictory, it's difficult, really, to get an accurate sense of what really happened. And there are many reasons for this. First, there was a need to control the narrative right from the beginning. Radicals such as Sam Adams wanted to set the narrative to advance their political agenda. And the British, for their part, wanted to protect their image and assert their control over an increasingly rebellious colony. And British national pride, especially through its British loyalist sympathizers, was at stake. And third, Paul Revere, a clever businessman, wanted in large part to monetize the event. So let's talk about how the narrative about the Boston Massacre was created. And this will also tell you something about how stories are told in court. The event begins in confusion. The basic facts are unclear. Its participants are trying to make sense of what has just happened. And the next step is the period of contestation, where competing interests construct alternative narratives, with each highlighting some aspects of the event and suppressing others. And during this process, each side, whether it be the loyalist or the radical revolutionary, tries out various scenarios and views and gradually develops a coherent interpretation. Now, as you know, we all know, our minds do not recall everything that we see objectively. In moments of stress, the mind picks up patches of highly subjective impressions, and is only really through a narrative, by subsequently devising a story, organizing those patches of memory into a meaningful pattern, that a dramatic episode develops into a form that can be remembered, interpreted, and argued. We used to see this all the time in the courts. So the Boston Massacre offers an opportunity to observe perfectly how flashes of memory gradually develop competing narratives. So, was it a massacre? Was it a massacre? Interesting. Well, in today's use of the term, the word massacre implies a high body count. But actually, in the 18th century, in the colonist time, the term massacre could simply apply even to an individual death, just one death, if it was committed with cruelty and atrocity. And here is where Sam Adams enters the picture. He was an accomplished political strategist and skillfully employed that phrase as political rhetoric. And by comparison, how did the British view this? The British soldiers and their political allies refer to the event. Take a look at this pamphlet from the 1770. It's called A Fair Account of the Late Unhappy Disturbance at Boston in New England. The unhappy disturbance. And how did the colonists see it? As a horrid massacre. And those initials on the coffin are for the 5 people who died that night. Immediately after the event, people on all sides began to spin out explanations to depended on their divergent views of the town and its occupiers. And the townspeople of Boston shaped the narrative to focus on their long-standing complaints about the town's occupation by British soldiers. They viewed the event as the culmination of an unjust encroachment on their rights. And perhaps the most powerful propaganda weapon in the colonists' arsenal is a simple sketch, one supposedly drawn by Paul Revere and widely distributed throughout the colonies and down through history. And to this day, this is how we remember the Boston Massacre. But this engraving is not without controversy. Revere's image is created to express outrage at the actions of the British soldiers and solicit support for the Patriot cause. Here's his first sketch, by the way. There's a rough draft of it. And the images of the confrontation between the soldiers and the townspeople, which we know didn't happen that way at all. They're compelling, they're significant, but they're completely historically inaccurate. Revere influences public opinion by depicting a line of redcoats firing point-blank range into a defenseless crowd, when in fact there was no such organized military action, and the soldiers were facing an unruly mob of about 60 to 100 people. Paul Revere actually stole this sketch from a Boston painter and engraver, Henry Putnam, with whom he shared a workplace. This is the first sketch of the Boston Massacre. Revere and Pelham were not business partners, but they shared space in downtown Boston. Revere revisited the print shop when Putnam wasn't there and stole Putnam's work as his own. Changed it slightly. Henry Pelham's print is on the left, Revere's is on the right. There are 18 significant differences between the two sketches. I won't. I think Jean has a printout for you. Those of you who are registered for this evening, that you'll see the differences that Revere put in there. But eventually, what it comes to is this: that Paul Revere is one of the first intellectual property thieves. He worked from Pelham's rendition of the scene, created, advertised, and issued his own version called The Bloody Massacre, ahead of Pelham's. And Pelham angrily complains in writing to Revere. When I heard that you was cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you were not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine, and I thought I entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. Well, Henry Pelham lost out on fame and fortune because Revere got his print into the marketplace first. Now, although there were no laws protecting intellectual property at the time, what Revere did was unseemly at best and thievery at worst. And now turning to this story about Crispus Attucks. There is one more important person in this drama to focus on this evening. The first person killed that Monday night in the Boston Massacre, and the first death in the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks. Now, as best as historians can determine, Attucks was actually born in Framingham, of African and Native American descent. Town records describe him as having been the slave of a Deacon William Brown, and it's thought that he had been a runaway slave, then became a sailor and a whaler, working either at sea or around the docks on the Atlantic seaboard. And during that fateful evening of March 5th, Attucks was part of a group of men who approached the townhouse armed with clubs. Attucks struck a British soldier with a piece of wood. He took 2 bullets in the chest and died that night. And his body was carried over to Faneuil Hall, where it lay in state for 4 days. And later, it was buried along with the other victims that night, all together in the same granary burial ground on Tremont Street. So, who won? And that's the gravestone, as you can see. So who won the battle for the narrative? Well, the very fact that we refer to the event as the Boston Massacre means in and of itself that we've formed a judgment about the event. And what are the enduring lessons of the Boston Massacre? First, it has been invoked repeatedly for over 2 centuries to describe when the government misuses its power against its citizens. And second, it started the American Revolution. As historian, author, and Massachusetts judge Hilaire Zobel has written, the trial was a propaganda battle. So, to sum up, the Boston Massacre was a seminal event in the lead up to the break for independence from England. The story has many facets, The trials tell the story of conflicting evidence, the role of reasonable doubt for the jury to consider, and whether someone could get a fair trial despite citizen hysteria. But one point is clear: it's by its happening, the American Revolution was coming. And now, as Paul Harvey, the radio broadcaster, used to say, now for the rest of the story. One of the British soldiers, Pierce Butler, left the army, moved to South Carolina, and became a plantation owner. And in 1787, this soldier, former British soldier, became a member of the Continental Congress, which drafted the United States Constitution. And here is Pierce Butler's signature on the United States Constitution. There it is. So where South Carolina is located, in the lower left. And finally, if you were to visit the site of the Boston Massacre today, be aware that the memorial stones laid out in this circle on State Street are not where it occurred. Even those reenactors, for whatever reason, maybe they didn't have a police detail, they had the event, the riot and confrontation occurring there. It did not occur there. Private White was confronted by the wigmaker's apprentice in front of the townhouse, but no, it occurred at down where 60 State Street is located. Yeah, 60 State Street, a large office building. And that's where the custom house was, as well as the quarters for the British soldiers. In any event, the city of Boston moved that historical site because they wanted to widen Congress Street in Boston near Faneuil Hall. So much for urban renewal and historical accuracy. That is not the site of the Boston Massacre. In any event, I have a bibliography of those who are interested. I think Jean has it, and she can send it out to you. The best books on the Boston Massacre really are two in number. Hilla Zobel's book, the last one there, The Boston Massacre, was done, 55 years ago. And Eric Hinderaker did Boston's Massacre. I think it was kind of, to be honest with you, I think it was like a Paul Revere taking Hilla Zobel's work and fashioning it as his own. And he issued a book in 2017. The better book is Hilla Zobel's book, in any event. So I want to thank you all for your attention this evening. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, my email address is up in the upper left-hand corner, small case letter J, Dennis, DENNISCURRAN @gmail.com. And no talk would be complete without me showing my grandson, Story Zuwasti Curran.
He's
And
so
this is
cute,
him now.
Judge Curran. Oh my gosh, what a cute kid.
Isn't he?
Ah,
Yeah,
adorable.
isn't he?
The little judge.
And this is him now. He's now 8 years old. And my granddaughter, Alma, who's all of 3.
I like the boots.
And thank you, Jean, and the
great.
Friends of the Milton Public Library, which sponsored this evening's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Curran. That was great. That was so interesting. And I think that Paul Revere should get that T branded on his hand, or he should have. For thievery.
Well put, Jean. Well put.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So now if you stop the share, I'm going to type your email address in the chat too, but we have a few questions and that way we can see everyone. Let me just see. I'm going to go to.
Hello, John Moses.
Hey, Dennis.
Good to see you.
Great talk. Thank you.
Now,
Thank you,
everyone
John.
can unmute themselves too, just so you know. But now, Judge Curran, do you see these questions in the chat?
I haven't put them up.
Okay,
hold on one second.
Yeah, the first one is, did Pelham ever sue Revere or get any recourse from Revere?
Oh God, no. No, he didn't sue him. He just licked his wounds and went on with life. No, it was, he knew what Revere had done, but and let everybody in. Don't forget, Boston was a small town in those days, so I'm sure he told as many people as he could. But suing somebody, it's not like today where you sued somebody if they look at you cross-eyed. They didn't
Yeah,
use the courts in that way.
I don't like him anymore, Paul Revere. Okay. All right. So then, thank you. And so that was Robert asking the question. And then he says, did Josiah Quincy, cousin of Adams, also get negative feedback for being part of the defense? Why would he take on being part of the defense?
Um, that's a good question. He might have had loyalist sympathies. And don't forget, these guys were they were lawyers, so they were paid for their services. By the way, Adams complained to anyone who would listen to him that he was underpaid for the job that he did for Captain Preston. But the truth is, because the historians have gone into the records, they found out that he was paid £60, which in those days was a considerable amount of money. He said that he was only paid £30, but people play fast and loose with the truth when they want to aggrandize their own roles. That he was this hero of, a hero lawyer taking on an unpopular cause. The truth behind John, this is another part of his representation. Before Adams formally agreed to be Preston's lawyer, he met with the town fathers, all the influential people in the town of Boston who were against the crown. And he sat down with them and he said, look, I'm just going to take this job. I'm going to do it faithfully because I'm a lawyer, but don't hold it against me or tell me now if you're really going to hold it against me if I take this job. So the rabble rousers, except for Sam Adams, kind of got the word to go lightly on criticism of John Adams, but he kind of softened the blow, so to speak, when he took the job, when he met with them privately. A lot of people don't know that part of the story.
Interesting. Okay. So there were a couple more comments, but before we go there, I just want to tell all of you who live in Milton. I got this message from Linda Peary from our Milton Historical Society. I had told her about the program and she shared the info with the board members. And she said, also, did you know there's a Milton connection to Boston Massacre trial? William Taylor of Milton, he'd later signed the Suffolk Resolves, was the grand jury foreman. Samuel
Oh,
Davenport, yeah, and Joseph Houghton of Milton were members of the grand jury. And I promised her I would share that.
well, thank you.
Interesting, huh? Yeah,
Any other
strong
any other
local connection.
questions or
Um,
comments?
Nancy just says, so fun, thank you. And Ron Caccini, I hope I said that correctly, Ron. Hi, thank you for an awesome presentation.
Ticini.
Okay, thanks. I had never heard the story about Butler. Can you speak more about that? How did Butler make the transition to being an American without getting killed in the process?
That's one of the untold stories of American history. A lot of the soldiers, British soldiers, a good number of them, when the British actually returned to England or foreign ports after the Revolution, a good number of the soldiers who were down in Charleston, South Carolina, hid in attics and basements to any family that would house them. And the townspeople actually looked after them because a lot of them had trades which were needed in the early days of the Republic. And so, and also, don't forget, a lot of these guys were young and may have had their eye on a lass down in South Carolina. So I'm sure that Pierce Butler was one of the ones who hid when the English headed back when the soldiers headed back. And by the way, those soldiers were all Irish, young Irish men, all of them.
Does that answer your question, Peter? Um, he's being very quiet. Oh, Ron, that was Ron. I'm sorry. Ron, did that answer your question? You can unmute yourself if you want to make a comment. Um, Also, Robert says, I have heard that Adams and Joseph Warren also agreed in quotes, that it was okay to defend Preston because it would give the impression that America could provide a fair trial. Any comments?
Yeah, I'm not so sure of that. Yeah, that was partly true. Yeah, that's true. But that you know, I have to be honest with you. Um, the history books really kind of ennoble people who are not necessarily so noble at the time. I found this. I do about 30 of these historical lectures about entitled Great Trials That Changed History. And when you scratch the surface, there's a lot of mythology that springs up after the fact. Yes, that may well have been a consideration, but I don't think it was a foremost consideration at all.
Okay.
I think it was his sense of duty and a professional obligation that ran the show more than anything else. But you're right, it was a consideration, but not as paramount as later scholars, some folks have maintained.
Okay. Um, so let me just say I put something in the chat. I hope everyone received the documents I sent you once you were registered for the program. If you did not receive them, please email me back. And Judge Kern, I'm not sure I have that bibliography you mentioned. I sent the summary
Oh,
called
you know what? I will send that in the next few minutes to
Good, and
you
then I
after I'm
can
done.
forward that tomorrow to people. But so I sent
Wonderful.
everyone the Boston Massacre trial summary and Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre 1770, that article, and then some links to find articles and websites about it, and then the people of Boston in the opinion of British General Gage. Right, those were the ones that I sent them.
Yep.
Okay.
Right. You're right. I'll send the bibliography right away. And I
Okay.
thank you all for your attention this evening. And thank you, Gene, and the Friends of the Milton Public Library for sponsoring this program.
You are welcome.
I like doing these.
It's great. It was a really good talk. I just want to say one more thing, which is Nancy says, Gene, could the library have him back for his great trials talk? Great trials talk. And I want to tell you that I just told Judge Curran at the beginning of the program that I'm hoping to have him back a couple of times because he has so many interesting topics. So this spring, I'm going to try to see if you have some Tuesday night openings, Judge Curran, and we'll do that. And I'm just going to put your email. I want to give everyone your email in case they want to ask you any more questions. And in the
Absolutely.
meantime, are there any more questions? Hold on. Let me just put his email.
You said that Adams raised the self-defense he came up with a self-defense statement of reasonable doubt, and that was unique. Was it unique to British law, or are you saying it was unique to the United States, the colony?
That's a very interesting question. The self-defense, the reasonable. Well, there's two issues there. Let me talk about the reasonable doubt issue first. That actually occurred in the 1760s in the Old Bailey Court in London. And so he was, we did not have American law at the time. We were governed by English law. So somehow in the law books or, talking with other lawyers, he used that reasonable doubt. It was one of the first times that it was ever used. And the judge adopted it in his his jury instructions. But it came from a case, and as a matter of fact, I have the research on that, and I'll send that to Gene as well, because there's a whole page of information about the reasonable doubt jury instruction. But it was relatively new at the time. It's a very good question, Nancy. And as self-defense, people have been using self-defense throughout millennia, so it wasn't really. But he gussied it up with some fancy language, and he made the jury think, well, what would I do in that situation? People are throwing all sorts of crap at me, and it was a riotous situation, and how would I have reacted? Similar, Nancy, to when we think about, I'm just looking at it clinically. Please understand, I'm not taking a side in this. I'm just using this as an example. in the Kyle Rittenhouse defense out in Kenosha, Wisconsin, about 3 or 4 years ago or so. Self-defense was the paramount issue in that case as well. So we have, we've seen it throughout history.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Okay,
This was
Nancy.
fascinating. It shed so much light, and it was just a wonderful talk. Thank you so
You
much.
know the beauty of this, Gene?
What's
It
that?
happened here.
Yes.
We're not in like Nebraska or in New Mexico. It happened, literally, what, 7 or 8 miles from where you folks are right now?
I know.
It's our city is so rich with history, and we walk by these places. If you go downtown Boston, you walk by it and you don't give it a second notice. Yet, if you were to go on Saturday or Sunday, you will see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, actually. And I can say this with some assurance because my law office, when I was practicing law, is right next to the State House, the old State House, at 1 State Street. And every Saturday or Sunday that I'd go in and work at my law office, I would see hundreds of people gathering around these sites, coming from all over America. And it's really a beautiful thing. And actually, Gene, if I have to confess, sometimes when a group of people are surrounding those memorial stones that I told you that are in the wrong place, I'll wait for an opening while the tour guide is speaking, and I'll say, folks, that's really not where it happened.
You can't help yourself, can you?
I can't help myself. I'm just on my way to lunch, but I'm thinking to myself, please
that's
don't
funny.
tell them the mythology of it.
I
But
bet they're interested to hear that, though.
yeah,
It's kind of disillusioning to think the history has been so, but that's probably true in history, for millennia. That
yeah.
we believe something that isn't completely accurate.
And it's been drilled into our mind so many times, but that's one of the beautiful things about this great trial series. I actually go back I've been doing this for about 12 years now. I go back into the original records to find out where things happened and how did the story get off into this mythological narrative, and usually, well, I'll save that for another time. A lot of the accounts that come down through history are just plain wrong.
Yeah, pretty
But they're
fascinating.
nevertheless, they're very interesting stories.
They are. And
Well, good night, all, and
Milton has such a wonderful, rich history as well, and I was glad to see that connection. So,
great.
thank you very much.
Thank you very
for
much.
being here, and thank
Good
you
night,
everyone
all.
for joining us. And Happy New Year, and I'll see you next time. Okay.
Very good.
Three, two, one.
Here we go.